Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Mission Evolution is coming to you on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, X-Zone TV on Simul TV Channel 32 from our broadcast studios in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. This hour we'll explore a new approach to breaking the chains of addiction. Most of us have dealt with addiction in one form or another. There are many approaches to treating it which have varying degrees of success. Is there a new tactic to treating addiction? Is there a more reliable technique to break its chains? With us this hour to consider possible alternative methods to address the problem of addiction is addiction treatment specialist TJ Woodward. TJ is the author of Conscious Recovery, A Fresh Perspective on Addiction. His website, tjwoodward.com. TJ, thanks for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here for this conversation and an important way to offer some people some new ways to not only view addiction, but to break the chains, as you're saying. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It seems to be an awfully important thing in our day and age right now. People are really suffering from it, from what I can see. TJ, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with sort of professionally who I am, and then I'll give a little bit of some of my personal story that led me to doing, why do I do what I do? But I've been working in the addiction treatment field since 2008. And when I came into the field, I came in kind of through the side door, if you will. My education and my experience is all in spirituality. And one of the conversations I'm so passionate about is science and spirituality and how they're meeting right now in this time in our evolution. In other words, like my friends who are PhDs and scientists are coming to very similar conclusions that I'm coming from a spiritual lens, and we're coming to the same awareness. And that awareness is, what if underneath all addictive behavior, there's still an essential self that is whole and perfect? And what difference would it create based on how we view someone with an addiction? In other words, if I'm looking at someone as broken and I'm diagnosing and treating them, there are more limited results. If in addition to that, I'm also saying, what might get created if I were to start to look for the inherent wholeness in a person and their own ability to heal? So that's really what I'm most passionate about.
Well, that's a good thing to be passionate about, because there certainly seems to be some missing elements, because we have been fighting and treating addiction for generations, and particularly lately, and with varying success. So would you mind defining addiction as we're going to be working with it? I mean, it's a buzzword, but what exactly is it?
Well, there are many different ways to define addiction. So there's no way I'm going to say mine is the absolute definition of addiction. But when I talk about addiction, I use a really broad umbrella, because I'm sure there are clinical definitions of addiction. And honestly, I think that's where we've gotten in trouble in some ways, because we've looked at it only clinically or only through this one very narrow definition. To me, addiction is anything, any substance, any behavior, or even any human that we're using to try to fix something that feels broken within. And then it becomes repetitive, and that's when we become addicted. In other words, we feel damaged and broken. We find something outside of ourselves that brings relief from that. And then we continue to use that over and over and over again. And I guess we would say the line that crosses over to addiction is when it's no longer really helping us or serving us the way it once did, but we're continuing to do it anyway.
So we're not just talking about alcohol and drug addiction. We're talking about sugar addiction, food addiction, relationship addiction, shopping addiction. Are we on the same page here?
We sure are. And you know, if we look at culture, Western culture, you know, the United States, maybe Canada, some of the Western, we really have a lot of addictions that maybe we wouldn't identify it. You know, like we're addicted to drama a lot, you know, in the media. We're, like you said, addicted to shopping. And sometimes when we have such a narrow focus on addiction as just drugs and alcohol, of course, that's one part of it. but it's much broader. And then in that way, I think more and more of us can relate. Oh yeah, in some way, I've definitely had some sort of addiction.
So, say for instance, workaholism. I mean, that looks very functional, right? You're a hard worker. When can you tell when it's kind of gone over the line and we're looking at addictive behavior versus creative behavior?
Well, one of the frameworks that I use in my work is this idea that we are carrying around core false beliefs. And then because of these core false beliefs, we develop what I call brilliant strategies. Some might call a coping mechanism. I've reframed it. The reason I'm starting with that is, as you said, if someone has what we might call workaholism, there's a lot of support for it. They're high achievers. They're doing really well, whether they have their own company, they're a CEO, or they're an employee who's working really hard. Where it crosses the line for me is when that brilliant strategy is no longer brilliant. So let me break it down a little bit, because a lot of times with workaholism, not always, but a lot of times, the core false belief that is often buried very deeply in the unconscious might be, I'm not worthy. And this is developed really early in life. And one of the ways we feel worthy is by achieving. Maybe we get love and acceptance from our teachers, our parents, and then we develop that as a strategy. And then when we're doing it and it seems to be serving us, of course, it's great. When we cross a line and we're realizing that more we're doing this, it's actually not helping us feel worthy, it's having the counter effect, that's when we can start to say it's most likely an addiction. So in some ways, it's very simple, but we have to decide that for ourselves. Where is that line when it shifts from it is a brilliant strategy that is serving me to it's a strategy that's actually not getting me what I truly desire?
So we've seen in the past 20 years, particularly teenagers, just achieving beautifully in school. They're in every sports there is. They're valedictorian. And all of a sudden, they commit suicide. And people go, "What happened?" Is this an example of when a good coping mechanism goes bad?
I think it absolutely can be. That's exactly right. Because what we know is that the strategy, when it's developed, and like I said, usually early on, it is something that helps us manage or cope. But I actually think it helps us thrive in some ways. But there's a line that gets crossed, and then we're really believing that if I don't achieve, like I've worked with people, for example, who look really very successful on the outside. Um, One in particular I'm thinking of, and of course I won't give the details of the person, but she was a lawyer and she wanted to make partner, and she had always gotten everything she'd ever wanted. And she worked so hard to become a partner in her law firm, and working 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week. And then the day came and she didn't get partner, and her whole world collapsed because she had hooked everything, her entire identity and her existence, on not only being a lawyer, but making partner in her firm. So these are the examples of somehow she looked really great and successful on the outside, but when that day came, her whole world collapsed.
So, what is it, TJ, that causes us to attach our self worth on something outside of ourself? It seems like that's maybe the core problem here.
It really is. And I've identified the three root causes of addictive tendencies as unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. And if we look at culture now, there is a big focus on unresolved trauma. We're talking about it more and more. And that's another thing we could, do probably a whole show on, like, what is trauma? But we're also talking about shame. And when these three things, or two out of three of these things, exist in one person, we end up often, very often, looking outside of ourselves to try to assuage this sense of emptiness inside. And I think that's really, if we, to use a term, that's really a pandemic in our culture now, is this outer seeking. And then, of course, with social media and everything else, it gets even more and more deeply entrenched that we become an image of ourselves rather than being authentically who we are.
Aren't we also being, you mentioned social media, media in general, advertising, aren't we kind of being fed the very things that we become addicted to?
100%. And through social media, through advertising, through just culture in general, I think all of us, or many of us, I would say, or maybe I could even say the vast majority, have what I call a destination addiction. Once I get this, I will be happy. Maybe it's a degree, maybe it's a partner. Once I have my first child, I'll be happy. Once, like I said, make partner in the law firm. Whatever it is, there's a lot of times, a lot of focus for many of us on what's next instead of what's now. And that causes, I think, a sense of emptiness or a sense of dissatisfaction that creates this longing for relief.
But who's in the now? I mean, if you're in the now, you're standing there in a room full of people, very much alone, from what I've experienced.
What,
When did we leave the now and why?
well, I think we get trained at a very early age to leave the now. I can tell you a perfect example of this. I remember when my nephew went to kindergarten and I called him after, I think it was the day after his first day of school, or maybe the night, whatever it was, right at the beginning. And I was talking to him. He's a 5-year-old. And I said, "Orion, how is school?" And he said, "Silly uncle." Literally, he said, "Silly uncle. I'm not in school. I'm talking to you."
Now
So
that's being in the now.
that's being in the now. And what the information that tells us is that that's actually innate, but we start teaching people how to not live in the now. So I agree with you that when we return to the now, it might feel lonely. But the more and more we practice being in the now, some really miraculous things start to happen.
Well, we're going to have to pick up on being in the now on the other side of a commercial break. TG and I will return very shortly, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Does anyone really have a cure for addiction? With us this hour discussing options is TJ Woodward. TJ, one thing I wanted to ask, we've talked about so far the things that come up in a person's life and coping mechanisms that can often lead or do often lead to addiction. But what about genetic predisposition versus nature, nurture, that kind of thing?
Well, I am so happy you asked, because this is literally one of my favorite conversations. And I want to start by saying the mind, my mind, and many minds are programmed to believe, or we've been trained to think it's either this or it's this. And in my experience, it's probably a little of this and of this. And so in my work, because of my experience, because of my own journey, because of my education, I tend to live more in the spiritual room. And there is an Indian proverb that says we're a house with 4 rooms: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And of course, there is addiction that lives in all of those rooms, and there is recovery from addiction that can live in all of those rooms. So when I say, for example, that the 3 root causes of addiction are unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame, I'm really talking about the emotional and spiritual room. That's a long-winded way of saying there probably are, or most likely are, some genetic predispositions to addiction. But where I'm curious, and the conversation I want to be in, is oftentimes people stop there. The Western medical model is, let's look at the genetic predisposition, let's figure out what the symptomology is, and let's figure out how to eradicate them. And I think that's where we've gotten caught in being stuck in this only one way of viewing addiction. All of that is useful and important. And then I'm coming in and saying, there's also all of these environmental issues. There's these things that happen to us spiritually and emotionally that are also creating or causing addiction. And in order to have a truly holistic approach, we're going to want to treat in all of those rooms as well.
So, I think most people can relate to this. As a child growing up, or even as an adult, you're kind of struggling to get something to work. And all of a sudden, something you do works. Okay. And that's so empowering that you then start applying it to most all situations, whether it's workaholism or being the one that has all the answers, or being the servitude kind of person, or whatever. Can we backtrack and find those places and rewrite them?
100%. And the key to this, and I love what you're bringing to the conversation, the key to it is most often, I would say high 90 percentile of most often, this is happening in the unconscious. Most of us aren't even aware of why we do what we do, right? And that's why in my work, I talk about bringing the unconscious into conscious awareness. Carl Jung says, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life, and we will call it fate. And that really is what we're looking at here. And the key here is most of us develop not only these core false beliefs, but the brilliant strategies to manage the beliefs at a time when our brain isn't even developed. In other words, someone has an intense trauma, let's say at age 5. They don't even have a cognitive understanding of what's happening. They have an intense experience, and they end up burying the experience, not only the memory of it, but also the experience of what they decided about themselves in the world. And then they find something, as you said, that brings relief, and it works brilliantly. And then they find themselves as an adult, when things get difficult, they go back to this automatic response that they did when they were a child. And the key here is it's not an intellectual process. We don't talk ourselves out of the core false belief or the brilliant strategy. A wise person once said there are 3 steps: awareness, awareness, and awareness.
So, becoming aware of our unconscious operation, how do you even start that? I mean, it's unconscious, right? So, how do you get there?
Well, I think we start by looking at the conditions of our lives, right? What are those things that we see repeating themselves over and over and over again? If I hear myself saying things like, why does this keep happening to me? I thought this relationship was going to be different. I don't know what it is, but every time I find a new person to be in a relationship with, they seem different. But 6 months or a year into it, all the same dynamics are coming up. And it's very important. And I like to add something here. I don't mean we want to shift our blaming the world to blaming ourselves. We want to look at, oh, what is it about me that I keep choosing this? Not from a place of what's wrong here, but from a place of what's wanting to heal.
So, is there really a place for blame in this operation at all?
Well, if you want to stay stuck. and I mean,
There
and
you
I
have
say
it.
that kind of sarcastically, but I loved blaming the world for a long time. And then I loved blaming myself for a long time. And I use the word loved kind of maybe to be a little provocative, but there was a part of me who felt like I didn't deserve better. And so early in my own evolution, even into my recovery, I got sober really young, just before I turned 21. And the first 5 years of my recovery, I felt so broken, and the world seemed so broken, right? And I had all these core false beliefs, and it was a vibration. I was walking around the world, and the world did seem broken. And there was something about blaming the world and then blaming me that felt comfortable, as strange as it sounds, because again, it was unconscious.
Well, when you blame yourself, doesn't it give you the illusion of control? Like,
Oh,
if it's my fault, then maybe I can change it.
that's an interesting point of view. I love that. I love that. And maybe I'm trying to hearken back to, because of course, I blamed my parents. Everyone blames their parents. It seems for a long time it was their fault, right? And then I went to like, oh, I blamed me. And I don't know if it was because I felt like I had power to control it. I just felt like that's what I deserved. But I love your question, because that opens up a different possibility of like, yeah, some people might be doing that because we do have a sense of power or control, and maybe we felt powerless otherwise.
So, it seems like a lot of our time, and I think this does relate to addiction possibly, is spent dodging guilt and blame. I mean, I don't think they belong with us anywhere, but a lot of our time, and I think our coping mechanisms, are spent dodging guilt and shame. How does that interface with addiction?
Well, as I've said, identify shame as one of the root causes. And I think it's important to have a moment and talk about the difference between guilt and shame, because it's really key here. And this is the way we talk about it currently. I'm thinking about John Bradshaw, who wrote the book Healing the Shame That Binds You in the 80s. It was life-changing for me. He talked about healthy and unhealthy shame, and now we call it guilt and shame. And that really is, guilt is, I believe I've done something wrong, and shame is, I believe I am wrong. And we work with them very differently, because if I feel guilty about something, it's behavioral. I did something to harm someone. I go and make amends. Maybe I pay back the money, whatever it is. And then I feel better. But with shame, I believe I'm fundamentally broken or flawed. So the way we work with it is very different. This is about healing the original moment. And for some of us, we remember the moment. And for others, it's a series of events, usually early in life, that have caused us to develop this shame core. We heal shame through vulnerability and authenticity, through having safe relationships to speak the truth. And that's where we start to heal that.
Yeah, having a witness is usually pretty helpful, isn't it?
Yes, it was
Yeah.
certainly true for me.
Mhm. So, what about our unconscious beliefs? Are they part of the equation here?
100%. I mean, the unconscious beliefs, and this is where it's important to say it is a belief, but it's also a frequency. Now, let me say what I mean by that. I'm sure some people watching now are understanding completely. Oh, absolutely, I get that. For someone else, it might be, what are you talking about? Because a lot of times we talk about core beliefs, and I like to add core false beliefs, but we talk about them only through that mental room or the intellectual room. And so we try to change the narrative or change the belief, but really it's a vibration. So here's an example. If a person believes they're unlovable, it is a thought, yes, but it's also a vibration. And so in my own journey, I believed I was unlovable. And in my early, evolution, in my early spiritual journey, and in my early recovery, I could walk into a room and I could feel the vibration of the person that was going to confirm the core false belief. That wasn't conscious. It was just what I believed I deserved. And so we start to heal that at a vibrational level, which really is about healing the trauma, not about re-experiencing the trauma, but looking at how it's alive in our bodies now, and how can we start to heal that?
Well, you brought up an interesting point when we're talking about frequency. So, if you're carrying a "I don't deserve any better, I deserve to be abused, I deserve whatever" negative, and we walk into a room full of people, doesn't that very frequency draw that behavior out of them if they're not real conscious?
That's right, absolutely. It draws it out of them. It also they align, right? So if someone has a different vibration, let's look at it through the lens of like the perpetrator and the abuser, because we use the perpetrator and the abused, or the abuser and the abused, and we tend in our culture to blame one, not the other. And again, we're not talking about blame, because if I'm a person finding myself in these repetitively abusive relationships, we want to look at, and this is very important, I want everyone to hear me, we're not blaming the victim. We never want to do that. But when we're only blaming the perpetrator, when we're in that energy and not saying, what is it about me that I keep choosing this, not from a place of blame, but from a place of empowerment, actually. When I heal that, I'm going to start choosing differently, unconsciously and consciously.
So, can a person, suddenly act out towards another person and go, where'd that come from? That's not like me. Simply because of the resonance with the frequency the person's putting out, they're in victim and expecting to be blamed and abused.
It's interesting in the work that I do in behavioral health. I think a really healthy system, and I'm thinking of a clinical director who I worked with who was amazing. She would ask the question, is anyone noticing what this particular client is pulling for? And it would be an energy. So I think what you're saying, it's kind of like, in a way, it's kind of the advanced course, if you will, because a lot of times it's just like, well, I don't know why I'm doing this, but we bury it. But of course, we're accountable for our own behavior, and we might notice that certain people pull certain things out of us. So I think it's both, and it's not either or.
Isn't the antidote in either case conscious awareness?
It is, absolutely.
Not easy to come by, though.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I would say not easy to come by, but definitely not as difficult as staying unconscious. Right,
Or as costly, right?
right, exactly.
That can be an expensive equation. Well, when we
Yes,
get back on the other side, we're going to delve a little further into the unconscious, how to make it conscious, and what the advantages of doing that are. Are you game?
absolutely. I love it.
All right. TJ and I will be right back to continue this lovely discussion. So please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. What are you hooked on? With us discussing the many forms of addiction is TJ Woodward. His website, tjwoodward.com. TJ, as promised, we've ascertained over the last two segments that um, part of the problem, or a large part of the problem, from what you're telling us, is unconscious beliefs, unconscious behavior. But like I mentioned earlier, if it's unconscious, how do we get to it?
Well, as we kind of started the conversation, and I love that we're going to go deeper into it now, we look at the conditions of our life that repeat. I find that that's the number one way people are aware. You know, when we look at addiction, or when we look at what we call a coping mechanism, which I call a brilliant strategy, they're not problematic to us until they cause problems for us, right? So, you know, we don't call it an addiction as long as it's working. We call it fun. It's not until it starts causing problems. So a great starting point would be, what are the patterns that keep repeating in my life? Or, you know, I thought I was going to be happy when I got X, Y, or Z. Going back to that destination addiction conversation, we get the promotion, we're still not happy. I remember when I did a vision board, which is really a visualization board, and I manifested everything on the board. And I thought, is this all there is? That's the invitation to looking at the deeper approach, where we start to look at the unconscious.
So, as I'm understanding you, it's like the scenario repeats and we're the common denominator.
Yes.
That should be a red flag right there, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the invitation, really, because what we come to a place, most of us in our lives, when we realize it might be in a moment of divine inspiration, it might be a series of being dissatisfied with things, but we come to a place where we realize it's really not about what's happening in the world. It's about what I'm bringing to this. And so that can come as a painful, you know, like we call it a red flag, like you said, or we call it like, I'm the one to blame. We're not going to blame ourselves. We're going to say, wow, this is an opportunity for me to actually start to change some of this, because it's not about finding the perfect partner. It's about becoming that. It's
For yourself, probably.
Yes, absolutely.
So, when we are in trauma, and if it's severe enough trauma, or we're young enough and have no wherewithal to process it, we forget about it and stuff it into the unconscious. Okay, we decided that early on.
Mhm.
But it seems to me like you're looking at a lot of pain. And the incident is still carrying the charge that the young child dealt with, feeling overwhelmed and no way to deal with it. Doesn't it feel the same when we dive into it? And how do we move beyond that fear, avoidance, that sort of thing?
Well, I think you're now into the $1 million question, right? And please feel free to send me $1 million when I answer this. But no, this really is, I think, the deeper approach here, because just as you said, 100%, we are often running from the pain of the experience, and it's unconscious. Anything we can do to not feel it. And the greatest paradox is, the only way to get through it is to feel it. I'm not saying, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying that we must go back and re-experience the trauma over and over again. What I am saying is, it's trapped in our body. Bessel van der Kolk said, I love the way he says it, trauma doesn't show up as a memory, it shows up as a reaction. And you're pointing to something that's really important. We need to feel it. A young child innately feels, and they allow themselves to feel whatever it is, sadness, anger, you know, any feeling that comes up, and then they allow it to move through them, and they go back to their natural state, which is joy. For some reason, we start training people not to do that, or we have a very significant event, as you said, where we either numb out or run away, right? The fight, flight, freeze response that we have. And that becomes the unconscious strategy, or the reaction that we find ourselves in over and over and over again. And the only way to really work through that is to learn how to be present with ourselves and feel what is present.
So you speak of presence, and I certainly can feel the importance of that. But when an incident in our environment triggers us into our trauma, we're being triggered into the past, and we are no longer present. Is that accurate? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Yes. And it's a nuanced conversation, and I love it. So it is. So I don't use the word trigger. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I use the word activation. So there's an event that happens, something gets touched within me, there's a wound that gets touched, and then I go into whatever reactive response I have. And so, as you're saying, it really isn't what's happening now. It's really a reaction to something that maybe happened 10, 20, 30, sometimes 50 years ago. And it's being what we once called triggered, but it's being activated. And then we can go unconscious really quickly. And we go into the strategy to try to protect ourselves. So, what we want to do is realize that we are here in this present moment. And the event that is getting touched is from the past. But here's where it gets kind of nuanced, but also, I think, a path to freedom is it really isn't the past, it's what's alive in our bodies right now. And when I learn how to tend to that, to be gentle with myself, and this can come in these moments of what we call trigger or activation, but it also comes from doing our own work over time where we realize, oh, this event that I'm seeing as something from the past isn't actually what's happening. Let me tend to what's present with me and learn how to heal or be present with what's present, if you will, with me right now in this moment.
So I'm going to take you back to another thing you said.
Great.
We're talking about you get activated, okay? And then you start going into the trauma and the trauma reaction.
Yeah.
Once we do that, can't we recreate the trauma because we're resonating with the frequency thereof?
Yeah, so here's where this is where it gets nuanced. I think sometimes we have an idea if we allow ourselves to feel what's present, we're going to get stuck there. So if we're unconscious 100%, we're back in the trauma. We're not even aware of what's happening. Our whole reality is based on the traumatic event, even if it's not a memory. And again, this is important because sometimes people will say, well, I'm not remembering a trauma, but they're in this reactivity. So they're in the automatic reaction mode, and that's what's present. And they can easily go unconscious, and we feel like we're powerless to do anything over that. When we pause and actually become present, and here's where it's paradoxical, the more I allow myself to feel it, but here's the key. What am I experiencing without the story? Just being present with what I'm experiencing, and even if I give myself 30 seconds or 60 seconds to feel it, we actually don't get stuck. It's in the pushing it away or the reactivity that's actually keeping it alive, sometimes for decades.
Sometimes for a lifetime.
Sometimes for a lifetime, yes.
So you speak of pausing. Is there something we do in that pause? Do you take a breath? Is there something that we can really start to condition ourselves so that we have it as a tool? Because it's not easy to pause when you're on a hellbound train with your history.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things I want to add here. One is I will come back to say, what do we do in the moment of activation? But I also think it's important to say that really what we want to do is we want to do this deeper healing work when we're not in the reactivity. And then when those moments of what we call a trigger or we get activated or a wound gets touched, we'll have a greater ability to do it. So I think anytime we talked about a safe witness, safety to me is the most important first step in trauma healing and in recovery. But we often think of that as an external, which it is, but it's also an internal. And that's really what I want to focus on. Learning how to be safe with myself. It's safe for me to feel this. I can hold it. And so, we often will say pause and count to 10, right? But what do we really want to do in those 10 seconds? What am I experiencing without the story? Can I figure out or feel into where it is alive in my body? Maybe put my hand where it is alive, take a breath and say, it's safe right now. There's an inner child process that I do that there's 3 phrases. It's okay for you to feel that way or this way. You're safe now, and I'm here for you. And we're talking to the inner child, or we're talking to the part of ourselves that feels wounded. So again, it's okay for you to feel, because most of us are saying, it's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to be sad. Don't feel that way. So first step, it's okay to feel. It's safe for you to feel, and I'm here for you. So even in 5 to 10 seconds, we can start to regulate that. And I'm not a big fan of the term emotional regulation, because that is implying that we want to change the emotion. Really, we want to learn to be present with it and allow it to move through us. And then we go back to that natural state, which is allowing the emotion to pass through us and returning to our natural state of joy.
So do you find or do you advocate? So you're in one of these experiences and you've done just exactly what you said, worked your way through it so that you brought yourself back present and you didn't go off the he's somewhere, okay, and attack somebody for being the one that was unfortunate enough to push your last nerve.
Right.
Um, do you find it useful to record that then some way so that when you're not in the triggered state, you can re-examine it and see what else it's brought to the surface to be worked with?
Sure, absolutely. I think anything we can do to bring about more awareness is useful. It could be to look at it after the fact. It could be, I'm not activated right now. Let me practice this, right? So the inner child process can be something we can do in meditation, or we can do with a coach or a therapist. It's something that we can do in the times that we're not, in this distress. So then when it happens, we're more acquainted with it, if you will. But then I love what you're saying. We also can go back and say, let me kind of examine, if you will, a little bit what I went through. And I always want to look for the victory. Wow, I stayed present for 3 minutes before I reacted, or 30 seconds. That's a huge victory. Next time, maybe I can do it for a little bit longer. And that's the way we start to shift the trajectory of our reactive life. Because the greatest freedom we will ever experience is freedom from the reaction, freedom from the reactive impulse.
So I think and we're about out of time in this segment, but part of what I'm looking for is I think there's a danger of inner child work turning into a full-time babysitting job to where you continue to get triggered. Oh, it's okay, little Susie, it's all right. Yeah, okay. And
Yeah.
it's an effective tool, but then can itself become an addiction, and how do we avoid that?
I think it can become an addiction. And in my experience, if I'm really allowing myself to feel, if I'm really allowing the inner child to feel, there's going to be less of a need to continue to go back to it. So, as in everything, it's yes and. Yes, it could be something that I just become like, oh, I'm just going to go right in. If I'm using it to not feel, that's not what I'm recommending here. Because I have heard people say to their inner child, oh, don't worry, you don't need to feel sad. No, 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 no.
Well, we are going to have to take that station pause. So please stay with us as TJ and I continue to explore the breaking the chains of addiction. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. What are the hidden faces of addiction? With us this hour discussing addiction is TJ Woodward. His website, tjwoodward.com. TJ, are there by my opening statement, are there addictions that we have as a culture and all our subcultures normalize behavior that we've normalized and don't even recognize as addictions but are still impacting us negatively?
Yeah, I think the number one addiction in our culture today is polarization, the idea of the other. If you look historically throughout human history, the the instinct to create the other was about survival, and that happens in the animal kingdom, right? So we have our tribe, we have our pack, we have our group, so that we can stay safe, and that has served us in some way. So if you look at this sort of through the lens of what we've been talking about, that was a brilliant strategy for survival. And now we want to ask ourselves, are we more than just animals? Are we also spiritual beings? Are we also intellectual beings? Are we also emotional beings? And what's the next level of evolution that is required, quite frankly, for the survival of the planet, but also for us to live in a more harmonious way? So I would say the number one addiction that I see in our culture is othering. And it's in this idea of me and you and us and them and good and bad and right and wrong. And the media propagates this, and it's very seductive. And you could also call it the human ego. But that, to me, that's the number one addiction that everything in some way is stemming from.
Doesn't othering serve to give us a place to project all that shame and guilt that we don't want to deal with?
Absolutely. We see that with politics, right? We see it, and this isn't about which side you're on. See, even the idea that we have the idea of a side in politics is that othering, is that polarization. I recently took a cruise with some family members who I live in LA, and my dad jokes that he lives in LA too, Lower Alabama. And we were talking about how if we were to interview people from one LA and the other LA, what judgment they might have about the other group. And then if you sit down and actually talk with someone we're more alike than we are different, right? So it's not about not acknowledging the other or the things that are unique or separate, seemingly separate, seemingly different, but it's about honoring that, but also realizing that that's not the truth of who we are. That's what we have, not who we are.
And this is the way we've been getting along, and actually, I think being exploited for generations, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, every war is based on that. Literally every war. This is mine, not yours. This is, my holy place, not yours. It's this idea of an other. And so, we can't solve, and I believe it's Einstein, at least is said to have said this, but you can't solve the problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So we can have peace talks, we can, all the things that we try to do, but until we have a shift in consciousness, which is moving beyond the tribalism, if you will, or the othering, that's the only way we're really going to create a different planet. And it's happening right now on planet Earth. I feel it.
Thank heavens, right?
Thank heavens.
So we've been talking a lot about spirit. Okay. And that's kind of a strange term that gets bantered around a lot. What are you talking about when you're talking about healing the spiritual aspect or spirit?
So for me, it's really important that people identify what that means to them, right? So like not my definition. People will often ask me, well, what does spirituality mean to you? And I will often ask, well, what does it mean to you? But I am willing to answer your question. When I talk about spirituality, I'm talking about a realization that we come into this world as a whole and perfect being. And if that doesn't work, we could say we come in as a blank canvas and then get programmed by the world. So it's the essential part of ourselves that is unharmed and unharmable. Buddhists would call it Buddha nature. Some might call it our God self. All the different words we use to define or describe the place within us that is whole and perfect. So for me, spirituality isn't really an outer search. It's really about returning to an inner experience that's always present.
So your approach, rather than patching things on top and managing behavior, is more of a unearthing said original blueprint?
Yes, absolutely. It's a twofold process to me. One, it's dedicating time to cultivating a relationship with that essential self. For some, that might be meditation. For others, it might be community, time in the silence, as we talked about, being present to the best of our ability. And then the other part of the process is all the unlearning. It's the excavation, it's the exploration of all the ideas we've been fed or we've believed about ourselves that have gotten concretized in our unconscious. So it's pretty much questioning and unlearning just about everything I've ever believed.
I had someone tell me one time, and I really kind of liked this. They said one of the ways to figure out that true aspect of yourself is, what do you admire most? What do you value most in others? Because that's a reflection of that part of yourself. So if we access this blueprint, okay, first by seeing what we admire in others, but then finally being able to resonate with it, does that then become the blueprint that we hold up against our behavior or the patterns that have come into our lives since the point that we came in?
Yes, once I have reconnected, and reconnected is only the mind because we're not really disconnected. But once I dedicate time to cultivating that relationship, it's like the patterns in our life start to shift. Almost, it feels like magic, right? So we do work in the physical world. We do work on our communication skills and our relationships. But what I'm saying and what you're saying is, once we really dedicate ourselves to really coming from this essential beingness, if you will, the conditions of the world become not only less significant, but they seem to start to change automatically. In other words, when I start to have different core false beliefs, that change those to core conclusions about my own inherent wholeness, I start to see that everywhere in the world. And just like you said, that projection that I see in others, what I possess within myself. So when I see someone being a kind and loving and open person, I also realize that is also true for me.
But it's a matter of unburying it through all the patterns, isn't it?
Right. Absolutely.
It seems like we're told who we are, what our motivations are from childhood. How many times have you heard somebody say, well, you think you're such and such and such and such, right? I mean, it's so common. Our parents do it, our teachers do it. How does one recognize what we've been programmed to be versus who we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think one example is that, I mean, there's so many examples, right? But we say to a young child, what are you going to be when you grow up? And really what we're saying is, what role are you going to play? Or like
Mhm.
you said, we end up labeling, and this happens in family systems all the time. Well, you're just the selfish one, or you're just the gentle one. Regardless of whether we consider it negative or positive, we get fed all of this. I also think about astrology. I mean, astrology is a science, but the way a lot of us use it is, like, I'm a Leo, so I grew up being told you're outgoing, you're open, you're gregarious, people are going to love you, but you're also very selfish and self-centered. And all these messages came to me just because the day of the year I was born, right? And so how much of that did I absorb and say, oh, that must be true, right? So we end up, creating our lives based on these ideas that we've absorbed about ourselves.
There's another aspect to this I'd like to delve into a little while with you, and that is we do come with certain tendencies. We do come with certain frequencies that are ours to surf this lifetime.
Yes.
But rather than labeling them, how can we transmute them to our advantage, to be all that we can be versus limited by the I'm a Leo and therefore I'm going to be vain? Okay.
Well, it's interesting because when we tend to think of certain things as negative and certain things as positive, right? And what if all of it is useful, and in some ways it might not be useful? In other words, I'm a very independent person. So when the volume on that independence is at a certain level, then it becomes very useful, right? I'm a self-starter, I'm entrepreneurial, I've started businesses, I've done all these amazing things. But when I have that volume turned way up, then it becomes, I don't need you. It becomes isolating. So it is true, I'm guessing, that we come in with certain tendencies, right? So this is the age-old question of nature and nurture. And like we said before, what if it's both, right? What if I came in with certain tendencies, and then at the same time I was programmed? And part of the program, if you will, is this idea that it might be positive or negative, right? Like, one of my siblings was told she was selfish a lot growing up. And it's like, that's a big burden to put on a little child, right?
Absolutely.
And, maybe we call it independent instead of selfish, right? And it's about balance.
Balance is the key. TJ, it's time in the show when I have to ask you, what is your mission?
It's interesting. I, at one point in a period where I was in a major transition, I wrote my personal mission statement. And my personal mission statement hasn't changed. And so I can actually answer that with my own mission statement. It changed my life when I did this. My mission is to be a catalyst for and a witness to personal and global transformation.
Mm, in a nutshell, and very powerful.
Thank you.
So, to wrap this up, how does one choose a recovery path and support system for their personal long term health and recovery?
Well, I think, it's always about that. It's a big question, right? Because if we're talking about, there's an outside and there's an inside, there's the inside job and the outside. And for me, it started with finding safe community. So I think if a person who's watching right now, maybe having a time when they're questioning some of their behavior, is this an addiction? I always want to say, let's start with professional help, right? Let's start with finding a therapist or a counselor or a coach that can help us get in touch with what's true for us. And then from there are a lot of different communities that one can find. And what I'll say is, there's no one size fits all. So, find what's true for you. What I will say, though, is community is such an important part. Maybe it's just because I'm an extrovert, but it really was such an important part of my journey in the beginning. So I was in different support groups that really did serve me.
Well, real quickly, TJ, because we're out of time here, where do people find your book?
TJWoodward.com. You can find all my books and all the information about me there.
Fantastic. Well, TJ, thank you so much for your service to the world and for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a true honor being in this conversation.
Our guest this hour has been TJ Woodward, the author of Conscious Recovery, A Fresh Perspective on Addiction. His website, tjwoodward.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to visit past archived episodes, visit our website, missionevolution.com. www.enlightens.org. But most importantly, please be sure to join us right here next time as this mission continues, bringing information, resources, and support to our evolving world.